Hello and welcome to episode 102 of PhotoKitchen. I'm your humble host, MD Welch, and today I share with you a revelation that I had while recently teaching a lighting workshop. Now, this is a bit of an epiphany, but I think that I have realized that we've been teaching, learning, and using flash or strobe photography in a studio space wrong this entire time. Now, that's a very bold statement, and before you crack the knuckles and start typing in the comments field, let me say that maybe I'm not reinventing the wheel here, but I do believe that I'm describing how the wheel works and how you should set the wheel better than most people have before, because I don't think we've been approaching this correctly. Now, to understand this, I want to switch gears a little bit and take you into the world of TV and movies, because that is how they handle exposure correctly with their cameras, compared to photographers that I think are doing it wrong. So on a TV or movie set, the cinematographer will come on and they will set up their camera based upon all sorts of needs. What the director wants, the depth of field, the type of motion that's being captured. But here's the interesting thing. At no real point are they concerned with exposure. Now, again, we're talking about a studio space in still photography, and I'm also talking about studio space in TV or movies. They have all the lights there. They're not worried about exposure. Certainly working outside, both in still photography and in the TV world, you're gonna have to make adjustments, and I'm only talking about working in a studio space here. But a lot of what you're gonna learn in this video can be applied there, and then you could change a few other settings. So the cinematographer puts up their camera, drops on a lens, and then starts their process of making their camera settings. But here's the thing. Those exposure variables, that exposure triangle, has nothing to do with exposure in the mind of the cinematographer. And again, you're like, what? Let me go further. ISO or film speed is usually locked and kept as low as possible or at the base ISO of a digital camera. A cinematographer doesn't want to be changing their ISO or their film stock just because they need a little bit more or less exposure. It's going to be what it is, and it's going to be set that way. And it's usually, in a lot of newer camera cases, set at the native or base ISO of the camera. Now a lot of cameras have dual ISOs, so you have one range or another range, but cinematographers rarely get out of those two ranges. They're not just going, oh, it's a little bit dark, I'll add, I'll go from ISO 400 to 800. They're not doing that. They're leaving it low, they're leaving it consistent, and they're not changing it, and they're certainly not changing it based upon exposure. Now, sure, small independent movies that don't have a lot of money or working on location with lighting packages, they're gonna make that change. But interestingly enough, that's probably one of the few parts of exposure that they're ever going to adjust based upon lighting. Because when it comes to shutter speed has nothing to do with exposure on a movie set. It's all about capturing motion. You have your frame rate of your camera. So in a shoot like this, any other normal TV movie shoot, you're working around 24 frames per second, 180-degree plane shutter. That means you take 24, multiply it by 2, gives you 48. That's 1/48th of a second. That is your shutter speed. That gives you a nice frames per second that the eye likes to process. It also gives you a nice sense of motion at 1/48th on that 180-degree shutter. Everybody's happy. The cinematographer is not going to make an adjustment to that setting unless A, the frame rate changes, in which case frame rate goes to whatever number that it is, 60, 120, they're still multiplying by 2, or they want to create a sense of different motion. Raising the shutter speed but not changing the frame rate will give you a staccato effect, right? That opening to Saving Private Ryan by Steven Spielberg. You have this kind of jitteriness. It creates anxiety in the viewer. You raise your shutter speed, keep your frame rate the same, and you will get this kind of jittery look to it, almost to the point where it'll start to look like a photo if you raise your shutter speed high enough. If you want to create somebody hallucinating or having a dreamlike state, you go the opposite direction. You lower your shutter speed. Frame rate's still the same, but your shutter speed gets lowered. The only time you're changing frame rate is because you're doing high speed or low speed stuff, and the only time you're changing your shutter speed relative to your frame rate is because you're dealing with motion. But at no point does the cinematographer look at shutter speed and go, I'm going to adjust this or change this based upon the needs of exposure. And that leaves us with aperture. And aperture is going to be dictated by a cinematographer based upon the lens that they're using, the distance away, and what depth of field that they want. That's how they're going to get the aperture that they need. So is it a one shot? Is it a two shot? Is it a group shot? Does the whole group need to be in focus? Can you rack between people talking so you're shifting focus on the lens? Or does they need to stay in focus the entire time? That's what dictates the aperture. Once those settings are done, the cinematographer is going to work with the electrician and gaffers and all of those other great teams and departments on a set, and they're going to get the lighting that they need to meet the needs of the camera. The camera's not changing for the exposure. The lights are changing for the exposure. And that's where I think we've been making our mistake. Let's take this information, go back into the world of still photography, because we do very much the same thing as cinematographers do. You walk into a studio space, you're usually going to have your ISO very low, 100, 200. And just like a cinematographer, you're probably only raising that because you just don't have enough power in your strobes. And if that's the case, you might think that it's time to buy some more powerful strobes. And I'm sorry to say buying more gear on an episode of PhotoKitchen, but you might need more power out of your strobes if you find yourself raising your ISO too much. But for many people, they have enough power in their strobes, 100, 200 on their ISO, or is at least as low as you can get it. Your shutter speed is going to be set in a way that you don't have any ambient light coming in. And this is usually set somewhere around 1/200th of a second. Some cameras go a little bit higher, some cameras go a little bit lower. My Sony shoots at 1/160th of a second. And by the way, yes, you have a high-speed sync. Yes, we're seeing global shutter come onto the market. But in reality, most people just hover around that 1/200th of a second mark. That knocks down any ambient light that might be happening on set, takes away any modeling light contamination, and it just allows you to work with your strobes. Low ISO, high shutter speed, that is usually the formula. And that's the way that we've been working this entire time. But it's that aperture. It's that aperture value that we've been mismanaging. See, we're still treating aperture as an exposure variable in still photography. We shouldn't. We should be treating it exactly like the cinematographer does and as controlling the depth of field that we have on our subject. I know that I've done it. I know you've seen other photographers do it, and you might have done it. You're doing studio work, you're doing strobe work, you look at the back of the camera, and it's a little too bright or a little too dark. Rather than going and changing the lights, which are your exposure devices, you're choosing to change your aperture. Oh, it's a little too bright. I'm at 4.0. I'll go to 4.5. Well, okay, you've achieved an exposure that you like, but now the problem is you've changed your depth of field. And if you're going between shots or images, you might find you have an inconsistency in your depth of field because of those aperture changes. And a lot of us, again, have probably fallen into this subconsciously. We know, oh, I'm doing a group shot. I'm shooting a 24-70 at 24. I need to be at 5.6 to get 3 rows of people because I'm so far back. That gives me a sharp depth of field. That's the way that it is. I do headshots. I shoot on a 135 millimeter lens. When I get back at distance to be sternum to head, I am usually shooting at f8 to get a nice corporate depth of field look out of that headshot. We have these recipes and these formulas, and we found them by trial and error. But wouldn't it have been better if we would have just started off in the process of saying, don't think of your camera as an exposure device, think of your camera as a motion capture device and a depth of field capture device, and think of only of your lighting as an exposure device? I think we would have been better off. So now that we have that information, let's take it, put it into practical use, and maybe win a few of you back, because I know you're thinking that I am insane at this point. What I have done is created a little still life off at the corner of the counter here. I have a little black canvas background. I have a little Deadpool figurine as Bob Ross. I'm not going to knock your socks off with this. This is pure mechanical, not aesthetics. I have a small softbox located off to the edge here, and we're just using one light to light this. Again, mechanics, principle, not the aesthetics, right? I mean, you could comment and say that this is a terrible photo. It is, but I'm not really worried about it too much. I have a Sony camera set up with a 35 millimeter lens a few inches away from the Deadpool figurine. Now, my ISO and my shutter speed are very much formulaic, right? It's part of that recipe that we talked about earlier. And for many photographers, this is what they do. They get their ISO as low as they can. In my case, it's 100. And they get their shutter speed as high as they can. In my case, it's 1/60th of a second. And rarely, if ever, in a studio space, do they change those numbers. The only reason, by the way, again, you would change ISO is just because you don't have enough watt seconds in your strobes to make the exposure that you want. But the third variable, the one that we've been struggling with, the one that a lot of photographers just kind of change haphazardly, aperture, we're going to determine that now. We're going to get our depth of field locked in, and we're not going to change it. It's going to stay locked. But how do you know what your depth of field needs to be? How do you know where to set your aperture? Here's a very easy solution that doesn't require using any strobes. Take your camera, throw it into aperture priority, and then throw your ISO into auto. With those two features set, now you can change your aperture, and your shutter speed should stay high enough that if you're hand holding a camera or photographing somebody moving, you won't get too slow of a shutter speed. I'm going to now set my aperture at 2.0 and take an image, and then take another image at 2.8, at 4.0, at 5.6, and f8. And I am sticking with the whole stop numbers here for aperture or f-stops just because to keep things simple. But of course, you could be shooting at 4.5 or 6.3, whatever that you want to work with. Now, when I review these images, and I've done this before, as all good cooking shows, we've practiced this recipe quite a bit. This is take 37 if you want to know the honest truth. I know from testing that 4.0 is the aperture that I want. I don't need a super shallow depth of field here, but 4.0 is going to work. I get a little bit of out of focus, get a little depth to the particular image. So with 4.0 in mind, I put the camera back into manual. ISO and shutter speed should not have changed, but you just double check them anyways. ISO 100, 1/160th of a second. And now I'm going to make sure that my aperture is at 4.0. And again, you're not going to change it. The camera is now strictly a motion depth of field capture device. You're letting it do its job. We now are going to turn our attention to our strobes. And this is where you're going to have a few different approaches to figure this out. The first approach is you can just turn on your strobes, maybe set them at mid power level, take a picture and see if it's too bright or it's too dark, and then start to adjust your strobe power as you go. And for a single light source, this is great, right? Multiple light sources, it starts to get a little bit more tricky, but for a single light source, you could certainly light by feel, as they like to say. Now, the other way to do this hurts me to say. I'm in distress. I'm having stomach acid just thinking about that. And that is the light meter. Now, I don't know what pains me more, to say light meter and to demo a light meter on camera, or probably reading all the comments from all the pro light meter people that are like, look, you were wrong the entire time. You should have been using a light meter. Yes, we should be using light meters. It is a better way to operate in certain instances. But before you go, chanting my name in the streets and yelling out my conversion, those people of the good church of exposure, let me explain that this is a starting point. It is not a final point. You might still make micro adjustments, but you already know what the camera needs to be. Rather than fiddling around and fumbling around with the light and setting the power, you can just get a reading here and figure out how much more or less power that strobe needs. Now to do that, I already have my meter turned on here. There we go. And I have my shutter speed and I have my ISO already inputted here. This particular Sekonic light meter, while being very expensive, it does at least let you lock in the features so I can't accidentally change shutter or ISO. So I have those settings in here. The little dome is recessed. By the way, if you need some tips, that's always the best way to work. Since it has a little swivel head, I could just swivel it towards the light. And since the distance is relatively close, I need to be relatively close when I take my measurement. Because Sekonic and ProPhoto do not get along, I have to have a transmitter here. I hit the read button and then I hit the test button to fire that off. So let's go ahead and put this into practice. I have it all set up. My dome is recessed. I'm going to reach over the background here. I'll hit my read button to start a new reading. I'll come over the front. I'll hit my test button. And conveniently, I have 5.6 on the meter. Funny how that happened. I want it to be 4.0. Now, this is where the biggest mistakes happen. A lot of times people use light meters and say, oh, it's 5.6, and they adjust the aperture on the camera. You don't want to do that. That's shifting your depth of field. What you want to do is get the meter to read the correct aperture that you want from the camera. So in this case, 5.6, it's one full stop. So I'm going to come into here and I'll pull one full stop out of here. I'll hit the read button again, take a new reading, and look at that, 4.0. Convenient, isn't it? So we'll go ahead and take a picture of 4.0, and indeed, I create a ho-hum image. Like I said, I'm not knocking anybody's socks off here with my work, but we do have a well-lit image, and we have the depth of field that we want to. So what does this all mean? Let's wrap this up. What you should be doing now is you should be treating your camera in a studio space with strobes as a device that's just capturing your focus and your motion, right? It's going to give you far more consistent results. You're going to be looking for the depth of field that you need. You're not going to be going home and seeing things that are too shallow or too sharp. You're going to get exactly what you want to, and you're going to be able to leave the camera alone. No adjustment anymore on the camera necessary. You're isolating it away from your actual strobes. Now you're only using your strobes for your exposure. Whether you want to light by feel or use the devil's tricorder here, it's totally up to you. But you will have a far more accurate image coming from both depth of field and your lighting. You'll be far more consistent, and you will find that this practice also makes it easier to work, because now you're not trying to be like, well, if a flash is too powerful, I can adjust my aperture or I can adjust my strobe. Now you've separated them, you've made them a lot easier, and hopefully you've made the process more enjoyable. So speaking of enjoying, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If so, please hit that like button. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. If you already have, thank you for your support. Also, leave some comments down below. I'd love to hear about how you approach Flash, studio work in a strobe environment? Are you already doing this? Is this opened up something for you? Is this a better approach? Have you already learned this from somebody else? If so, who is this mythical person? Do you love light meters? Do you look at it as the devil's tricorder? I would love to hear from you in the comments field. But until next time, this is PhotoKitchen. I'm MD Welch, wishing you all the best.